Hello, global students, and welcome to episode 2 of our Global History Regents exam review series. So, this section will cover the German and Italian unification. It'll get into Industrial Revolution, and then finishing with imperialism / colonization in the 19th century, the 1800s. So here we go. All right, first we have German unification. So, with German unification, you need to know its leader, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. So, Chancellor was basically the most important minister to the Kaiser. The Kaiser is the Emperor of Prussia. Remember, Prussia will eventually become Germany. Do not confuse Prussia with Russia. Very different, very different. All right, so Otto von Bismarck is going to have a major weapon to unify all of the German areas in Central Europe as one country called Germany. And it's going to be Realpolitik, also directly translated as realistic politics. Actually get it done. So, what that really means is a country that follows Realpolitik needs to do what's in their own best interest, often at the expense of another country. For example, if you're going to fight a war, make an alliance with another country, beat up your enemy, and then later on, don't be afraid to break that alliance and invade them. So Realpolitik is you're doing what's in your own best interest as a country, and we're going to see Bismarck use that for alliances and warfare as well. In the global regions, they don't ask too much about the wars of German unification, but the major one would be the Franco-Prussian War, where Prussia defeated France, and at the end of that war, which was 1871, Germany becomes a unified country. So from 1871 to, well, kind of the present day, Germany is a country. Obviously, the exception to that would be during the Cold War, where there were two Germanys, but you get the point. Key part, Otto von Bismarck, Realpolitik, and you'll be good to go. Italian unification will have actually a lot of similarities to German unification, except there's a few more leaders you should be aware of. Giuseppe Garibaldi, and he is the sword of the revolution, basically the military general who will lead his soldiers and unify like the southern portion of Italy. And this guy, he's actually considered like the father of Italy to the very day. Italians love Garibaldi. But then the person like behind the scenes, actually, putting the pieces of this Italian puzzle together is Count Camillo di Cavour. And he's kind of like the Italian equivalent of Bismarck from the last two slides. And he's going to make alliances with other countries to fight wars that will help unify Italy. So like when they win a war, they get some more Italian land. And eventually, by 1871, they make a new country called Italy. So, also, by the way, Count Camillo Cavour was a proponent of Realpolitik. Germans aren't the only ones using Realpolitik. The Italians were as well. Man, look at that beard. Oh, yeah. Okay, keep moving. All right, Industrial Revolution, you gotta know it. It comes up on like 98% of Regents exams. Really important time period. So make sure you know the general time period of the Industrial Revolution, which is the 1800s, the 19th century. What makes that nice to understand is new imperialism, which will be the next topic, is the same time period as well. So you have Industrial Revolution and imperialism happening at the same time. So it's a little bit easy dates for you to understand. All right, so most common questions about Industrial Revolution are the causes of it. So really the question is, what's going to cause the Industrial Revolution to start in Britain first? So it starts in Britain, and here's the why. One, the British start developing new types of farm technology that make growing food much more efficient and therefore cheaper. And when you have more food that's cheaper, usually baby making goes up. So food is more affordable. That's going to lead to a population explosion. There really aren't any like bubonic plagues that will wipe out, a third of Europe anymore. They still exist, but they're not actually like wiping out a significant number of people anymore. So, initially there's some improvement in medicine, but their key part though is cheaper food. Now, some effects of a population explosion is you now have more people who want things. Like, they want cheaper clothes. So there's a demand for it. And since you have more people, you now have more people who can work in factories, who can make those textiles to turn into t-shirts and stuff like that. So because you have more people, that now actually devalues their labor. So overall salaries aren't going to be looking too good right now, but eventually they will get paid more. So just know population explosion is going to be a key part of industrialization. You need more people if you're going to industrialize. All right, so why does it start in Britain? Here is your answer, and yes, it's the classic natural resources. So Britain is blessed to have a lot of iron and coal in its ground, and remember, iron is going to be very useful to make railroad tracks. You know, trains are made out of iron. And additionally, what powers the trains, and also the steam engine, arguably the most important invention of the 19th century, it's going to be coal. A little bit navigable rivers. So another form of transportation besides the railroad eventually will be putting things on rivers and also man-made canals. And that usually drops the price of goods because it's a cheaper version of transportation. Also, Britain is a small country. It's an island country. And they're going to need to import a lot of raw material. Like if they're going to make cotton textiles, you can't grow cotton in Britain. So they're going to use their colonies in India, import the raw cotton fiber to their ports. And Britain has a lot of ports because their coastline is very jagged, as you can see. And then they can turn it into textiles, cloth, and then they can export it, sell it back to their colonies. So having a lot of ports because of that jagged coastline, really, really important for Britain. All right. Some new technology of the Industrial Revolution. So the first two are all about making yarn textiles much faster. The spinning jenny is probably the most famous one. And actually today, the way we make textiles is a version of the spinning jenny. The technology really hasn't changed that much. It's just gotten faster, I suppose. But again, we can make these textiles faster, which happens to lower the price of goods. And all of these machines are now in factories. And so factories will help expedite the speed at which these things are produced. And again, that drops the price. What makes those machines operate is the steam engine. So again, most important invention of the 19th century, along with the train, will be the steam engine. Well, the steam engine powers the train, so probably the steam engine is more important. All right, effects of the Industrial Revolution. Here we go. Key part is effects on people. So major change in world history, especially European history, is going to be, for really the first time in women's history, women are now leaving their home to work. Usually, historically, before the 1800s, women stayed in their homes and, handmade textiles. Now, they're going to major cities like Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, all those English cities. And they're working in a textile factory where they're making cotton or wool textiles, as you can see in this drawing here. So problem with this is, A, they are paid at just about half of what a guy would make for the same amount of work. Additionally, after they're done putting in a 10-hour, 12-hour day, they still go home and they have to do all of that work that has been traditionally associated with women. So basically, women now are working twice as hard. So they still have that traditional perspective of it's still their job to take care of the kids and cook and things like that. So yeah, they're working elsewhere, but they're still coming home and having the same duties as before. All right, other social consequences or effects. Major one is going to be overcrowding. Urbanization means people are now moving from the countryside to cities. And one of the reasons for that was for the Enclosure Acts. The Enclosure Acts was when British Parliament allowed them to sell public land to rich people. And then basically poor farmers were without a job because people just bought their land and they can't work there anymore. So they moved to cities to work in the factories. So that led to urbanization, but also overcrowding. So because you now have so many people living in close confinement, that's going to lead to the increase of communicable diseases. We're going to see waterborne diseases like cholera, and it's getting kind of ugly and gross. Additionally, they don't actually have a sewage system in these major British cities and also other European cities. So they're going to have to remedy that. So can you imagine how disgusting it must have been in the early 1800s before they had a sewage system? Oh. All right, so despite that grossness, despite, the impact of child labor, 8-year-old kids in coal mines dying, overall, the Industrial Revolution actually will increase the life expectancy. So basically, look at the chart again, this little line graph. So before the British government starts, combating child labor, the life expectancy is decreasing. But once they start passing laws that say, child labor in coal mines is a bad idea, people shouldn't work 12-hour days, then we start seeing that life expectancy increase. So overall, by the end of the 1800s, people are living longer. Additionally, the middle class, the bourgeoisie, is getting really rich. They're the ones who own the factories. And usually when you become economically more wealthy, you also want political wealth. You want political power. So eventually the middle class, like I said in the previous episode, middle class will be the lead politicians and government leaders later on in the 20th century. This doesn't come up too often on the Regents, but every so often it does get referenced. So the Industrial Revolution showed that if the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, they will try and make as much money as humanly possible off of other people. So labor unions is when you have the people working in the factories, they get together and they create a union where they argue for better working conditions and higher pay. And they still exist today with the same idea. They want better working conditions and better pay. So labor unions were made to combat the abuses of the bourgeoisie, the middle class. All right, other effects of the Industrial Revolution. Major one is more imperialism, more colonization. So again, if Britain is going to be, making a lot of cotton textiles and they can't grow cotton in England, then they need to take it in some other way, and that's going to be using their own colonies. So most important British colony to know is India, and India produces the most cotton in the world, still to the very day. And additionally, so they can extract that raw material from their colonies, and they can also sell finished goods. A finished good would be now cotton cloth, shirts, clothes, other things like that, back to their colonies. So basically, they're making their money twice over. Another major impact, and this is going to have a connection to Karl Marx and communism, is, people, like regular people, the working class, they are getting paid a little bit more, but the discrepancy, the difference between the regular people, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the middle class, has grown much bigger. So there's now more social and economic inequality. Basically, the difference between the rich and the poor has gotten worse because of the Industrial Revolution, and that's what's going to lead to Karl Marx's creation of communism, to combat that. All right, so the next section is going to cover two new economic systems, one of which I briefly referenced in the previous episode, and it's going to be the creation of capitalism, and then the response to that, which will be communism. All right, so Adam Smith, like I said in our last episode, when you see his name, you're going to think laissez-faire economics. The government should not intervene in the economy, and that is basically our foundation of capitalism. And that's the Industrial Revolution. You can have factories owned by the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and they can produce as much as they want. They can charge whatever they want, and the government can't tell them what to do. So the capitalism, that's where it gets a little complicated. So if you want an actual definition of capitalism, it's this: private ownership of the means of production. Basically, regular people can own factories, they can own businesses, and they can decide for themselves what to charge. And the idea of capitalism is the way it regulates itself is you have a lot of people who do the same thing. So you have many people who make cars. When you have a lot of car producers that are competing with each other, competing for your money, then that will naturally lower prices. The problem happens is when you only have one, company that makes one thing, and then they can charge whatever they want. All right, so the opposite of capitalism will be communism. So Karl Marx, gotta know him. He's going to write a book called The Communist Manifesto, and he basically says the following: in all of history, the reason that we have had conflict and wars and whatever you want is because there is a significant difference, a class struggle between the people who are rich and the people who are poor. So the haves and the have-nots. So when we look at the Industrial Revolution, we have the bourgeoisie, the middle class, those factory owners, versus the people working in the factories, the working class. He called them the proletariat. And he said, when that difference between the rich and the poor gets so big, there will be a proletarian revolution, where the working class, the proletariat, overthrow capitalism, overthrow the middle class. They abolish classes altogether, and everybody shares the money equally. Obviously, that's in theory. It's never actually happened in human history, but that was his prediction. When that difference between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, gets so big, the proletariat overthrow capitalism and create communism, where everybody shares the wealth equally. Okay, now we are into new imperialism. So remember, imperialism and colonization, there is a difference. Basically, imperialism means one country controls somebody else, politically and economically. Colonization is like you fully take it over, put your own people, start living there. Think of like the British Empire and the British colonies in North America. That would be colonization and imperialism. So if you always want to be safe, just say imperialism and you'll always be right, okay? Say imperialism, you'll be right. So let's first start with new imperialism in Africa. So this is all the 1800s. So make a note to yourself, 19th century, 1800s is new imperialism, and this is where Africa will almost completely get colonized. Okay, like anything in history, if you know the causes, you know the effects, you're golden. So for imperialism in Africa, sometimes, by the way, it's called the scramble for Africa. Same thing. I think a scramble, they're all kind of like competing. Europeans are competing to take different parts of Africa. What they're looking for is going to be raw materials. So remember, this is the 1800s, same time period as the Industrial Revolution. So think about what literally fuels the Industrial Revolution. Coal. Africa has a lot of coal, has a lot of iron. Then there's some more luxury goods, diamonds, ivory, and gold. That shows your wealth. People want that. Then, really important, would be rubber. By the late 1800s, when they start making cars, and think about additionally the belts that run the gears in factories, that's all using rubber. The current area of the Congo, which is like sub-Saharan Central Africa, has those rubber plantations, and rubber is from trees. Additionally, as I mentioned in the previous slides, when you colonize a country, you can often sell your materials back to them and make your money twice over. The classic reason for imperialism is Europeans want to spread their religion to the places they're controlling, and that's going to mean spreading Christianity. So major countries are listed here: Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium. By the way, just make a note to yourself, Cecil Rhodes is going to be an English mining tycoon. He owned De Beers diamond mines, which controlled all of the diamond production in like this part of southern Africa. Okay, so some impacts of, or sorry, not impacts. One of the ways Europeans justified their imperialism in not just Africa, also South Asia, Southeast Asia, is going to be social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is this idea that one race is better or superior to another. Basically, think about the race of most Europeans. It's mostly white. And the people they're colonizing are black and brown. So they're saying that since their race is quote-unquote superior, then it's actually their obligation to help the other races. And that is the definition of the white man's burden. It's the burden of the white man to spread their own culture to the people they are colonizing. When I say culture, I mean religion, I mean language, I mean economic systems, parliament, stuff like that. That's the way Europeans are justifying their colonization and their control over the people they are taking over. All right, so really, really important moment in the colonization of Africa is the Berlin Conference. So I just covered the causes and the justification of European colonialism in Africa. This is how they actually decide which European country gets which part of Africa. So Berlin Conference 1884, led by now the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck's back. He is basically going to help decide, all right, Germany gets this part, France gets this part of Africa, Britain gets this part. They slice and dice Africa between European powers. Sometimes they use the term, they're dividing Africa into spheres of influence. So obviously, people from Africa were not represented. This is Europeans deciding what part of Africa they get. Berlin Conference got to know it. All right, now we have new imperialism in India, and this is going to be all about the British. So we know the British are involved in India because they want the raw materials, especially cotton. Tea is another major one, and also opium. So Indians, after, at this point, let's say just over 75 years of British control, they're going to start resisting British imperialism. So the British East India Company, which was that joint stock company that actually really governed India before the British government actually did, they hired Indians to serve in their own military, and those Indians were called sepoys. So basically, after 75 years of British control, and then all of a sudden the sepoys are given a new type of bullet cartridge, rifle cartridge, that is lubricated in pig and cow fat, which is against both the Hindu and the Islam religions. They revolt against the British, and it's like a year-long countrywide revolt in India. The British are going to crush this revolt, but it's important because, A, what can we talk about? What can we label this failed rebellion as? This is Indian nationalism. They're revolting against their colonizer. Yeah, they were unsuccessful, but still, it's a version of nationalism. It's a version of resistance. So then we're going to see the overall impacts of British rule in India. So I have it listed here. So overall, British control of India is going to last from the 1800s all the way to 1947, over 100 years. So because it's imperialism, that means the British Empire controls all the politics and the economics of India. Not Indians, the British do. Indians were segregated in their own country. White British people had the most privileges at the expense of Indians. Indians were required to purchase clothes from British merchants. We know later on Gandhi will revolt against that. He will create a form of resistance. That in particular is called the homespun movement. But the whole point of imperialism is the colonizer needs to get really wealthy at the expense of the people they're colonizing. All right. The last section for new imperialism is, not the last section. It's going to be China and later Japan. China. So, you got to know the Opium Wars. So the Opium Wars between Britain and China, Britain wins because Britain has the best military in the world and China doesn't, unfortunately. And so Britain forces China to sign the Treaty of Nanjing. And the Treaty of Nanjing basically gives the British a ton of power. And this is called an unequal treaty. So Britain is most importantly going to be able to have their citizens will only have to follow British law even while they're living in China. And additionally, Britain is going to have trading privileges or spheres of influence in China, and later on other European countries will economically control China. So basically, the Opium Wars is going to allow Europeans to now take their own economic slice of China. So China doesn't get colonized by Europeans, but they do get economically controlled by Europeans and also the Japanese. And those are called spheres of influence. All right, so the Chinese also resist, like India did. And this resistance was called the Boxer Rebellion. So sometimes the Regents will ask a question that says, what do both the Boxer Rebellion in China and the Sepoy Rebellion in India have in common? The answer, they both resisted imperialism. So here we have Chinese nationalists, they were called Boxers, and they start assassinating foreigners. Yes, this rebellion will be crushed because basically all of the Europeans and the United States and Japan are going to send in a force to destroy them, but still it's an example of resistance against imperialism. All right, last section is the growth of Japan. First, it's going to be economically controlled by the West, but then it will be its own imperial power later on, and it will modernize as well. Here we go. All right. So Japan is forcibly opened up to trade. Before 1854, Japan was isolated. It was led by the Tokugawa shogunate, where you had one family who controlled Japan. They had all the samurais, the Japanese feudal system, and now we have the United States forcing Japan to open itself up to trade first with the United States. So the Treaty of Kanagawa forces Japan to trade with the U.S., and then European countries will force Japan to trade. And the reason they're able to do that is because Japan does not have a modern military. They don't even use gunpowder until they are opened up to trade forcibly. So Matthew Perry was the American admiral, basically general in the Navy, who is going to force this to happen. So Treaty of Kanagawa, Japan is open to trade. Then we now have a new emperor. So you got to know Emperor Meiji. And if you see Emperor Meiji, the first 3 words that come into your brain is going to be Meiji westernizes, modernizes, and industrializes Japan. That is the vast majority of questions they ask about Meiji. So if you can get those 3 down, you're good. So basically what he's going to do is he is going to abolish the samurai completely and make a new military that are conscripts and volunteers. This conscript is someone who's drafted forcibly. And they're going to use rifles. They are trained by the United States military, sometimes the German military too. And they also are going to start hiring German and British engineers. They're going to start making an outstanding railway network. Again, the British invented the railways, so the Japanese are going to hire British people to make railways for them. So that's westernization, that's modernization, that's industrialization! Whew. So, now that they are an industrial power, they can also begin, and a military power, Japan will also begin colonizing and imperializing. And that process starts with Meiji. So by the time we get into the early 20th century, 1900s, now Japan will start taking over other countries. And that's going to eventually lead to World War II. All right. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.